Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining for class number 2 in our series on the teachings of Rabbi Nachman. Today we're going to tackle the topic of nigun, of the wordless melody in Rabbi Nachman, a very, very broad topic. So what I did is I brought different excerpts from different Torot of Rabbi Nachman. Like we said, each of his teachings are called a Torah. A Torah in and of itself, which can sound blasphemous, but you get used to it. I brought some excerpts, but he has a lot of Torah that focus on nigun, the power of nigun to attach us to each other, to attach us to the sparks of the divine in the world, to discern between good and evil, to make discernment and to have discerning choices. We're gonna tackle his fundamental understanding of nigun today. Where does nigun come from? How does nigun work? What's the mechanism of nigun? We'll go from there. I hope you'll connect to the teachings. This is largely based on the teachings of a teacher of mine from Migdalos. His name is Rabbi Itamar Eldar. That's what you see quoted in the Sfaria source sheet over and over again. So that's where we're going to start. I'm sharing screen here. Okay. Nigun. All right. So we're trying to understand what is nigun for Rabbi Nachman. And he talks about it. We're going to quote fundamentally basically two Torah of his, Gimel and 60. So Torah number 3 and Torah 65. And so 64, excuse me, section 5. But we'll begin with his teaching here from Torah number 3. He says, Hine, behold, someone who listens to the singing of a singer who is wicked. It is detrimental to the service of the Creator. And when you listen to a singer who is virtuous and worthy, it helps them, as I tovlo, as I will explain, or as will be explained. Okay, so he says that the source of the nigun is actually really important. The way that nigun is kind of brought into the world, the vessel that it's brought through, and the person that plays it for you. And the reason for this, he continues in the next section. The reason for this is that the voice of the song is drawn from birds, as we find in the Midrash, which makes sense, right? As I said before in our introductory class, what Rabbi Nachman likes to do is to kind of overlay images and juxtapose images one to the other. And through that, we get like a textured read of a concept. So it's kind of like creating artwork through juxtaposition of words that are images that we're supposed to see as a whole and gain some clarity from, right? So here we are. We have song, birds, right? As we find in the Midrash. Why is the purification of a leper dependent on 2 live pure birds? Let the chatterer come and atone for the chatterer, right? So the Midrash is picking up on what is commonly seen as the transgression of that precedes leprosy, which is lashon hara, right? Chattering. And so these live birds come and atone for, right? The chattering birds come to atone for the one who chatters for lashon hara. And so we see nimtza mishu kasher. We see that a virtuous person draws his song from 2 live pure birds. If we take a look down at the psukim themselves, I emphasize that, right? Zotia Torah mitzorah, Yom Tarato. This is the Torah of the purification of the mitzorah. Right, it tells about his purification process. And what's emphasized about the tziporim, about these birds, they are shtei tziporim chayot tehorot. They are living birds. Okay. The 8 eres, and it's dipped into one bird is slaughtered, ritually slaughtered. וציווה הכהן ושחט את הציפור האחת אל כלי חרס על מים חיים. And so the Kohen slaughters one of the birds over fresh water in an earthen vessel. And we're noticing that word to describe fresh water, like is mayim chayim, a living water source, a stream, water that's flowing naturally. And he shall take the live bird, and the Kohen takes the live bird along with the cedar wood, the crimson stuff, the hyssop, and dips them together with the live bird and the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over fresh water. So we're looking at these birds as sources of chayim, and that is emphasized that they're taken chayim, one is killed, and then we have this connection to mayim chayim, flowing water. Okay, so we're gonna take that background information and bring it back to Rabbi Nachman. Okay. So someone who is kosher or pure, his melody, his nigun comes from two living birds. And we see the teaching of the Zohar on this. He cites the teaching of the Zohar, that these two birds derive their nourishment from the same place that the prophets do. So the bird song, that is the source of song, comes from the same place as prophecy, which are yonkin, which nurse from the divine, right? Prophecy as something that comes down from the divine. Therefore, one who plays music is called a chazan, milashon chazon, connected to the word chazon, which is a vision, hainu lashon nevuah. So now we've made this connection of song and prophecy. But, continues Rabbi Nachman, Shemen rasha, when the singer is wicked, then he takes his song from other birds, as opposed to living birds. These are tziporim that are kind of part of this essence, that is part of the part of the world that is the husk. And that's what Rabbi Nachman will refer to as things that you kind of can't, the things that need to be sorted out before you can kind of access the divine essence that's hidden in the world. Because these kind of tziporim, right, that song that comes from the kind of more negative place or the more hidden place, the more opaque place, they nurse not from necessarily nivuah, from the place where the Nevi'im bring down their prophecy, but from malchutz, this essence of majesty, which we'll talk about in a bit. And in the middle of the night, there's an announcement that says, like the birds caught in the trap, like them are people are caught, ensnared. Okay. So about the Mitzorah, right? The Torah teaches us about the Mitzorah. So we'll get back to these other sections from Rabbi Nachman here. Returning to this imagery of the Mitzorah, the connection of singing, song, and the birds that are dafka used in this purification process of the leper. Okay, here we are. Okay. All right. So tzara'at, right, we mentioned is often associated with the sin of chattering, of gossiping, but the Mitzorah itself, right, the tzara'at itself is connected with death in the Torah. When Aaron talks about Miriam, his sister, he says, Al natihi kamet asher betzito me'rechim mo vayachel chatzi b'saro. Let Miriam not be like, with her tarat, let her not be like one who is dead, who emerges from his mother's womb with half his flesh eaten away, right? So we have other statements of Chazal associating the Mitzorah with someone who has died, with a dead person. And so here's Rabbi Tabar Eldar's explanation of the juxtaposition of all these images. Song asserts Rabbi Nachman is drawn from two birds. The two birds receive their nourishment from the place that the prophets receive their nourishment. And here Rabbi Nachman lumps together, as we saw, the singer, the chazan, and the prophet, and that they all receive their nourishment from the same place. Okay, so song ideally comes from the same place, and the issue is going to be with how it's interpreted into the world, how it's brought down into the world, right? And common to all three of them, argues Rabbi Nachman, is the use of voice. The voice is not the definitions or the framework, but the breath that blows from inside a person and plucks on the vocal cords, where it's transformed into speech and words. That breath, asserts Rabbi Nachman, which constitutes the song of the singer, the chazan, the prophet, the inspiration that is the living spirit of the world, drawing from those two live birds, is rooted in a spiritual source of holiness, which is identified by Rabbi Nachman as the place where prophets receive their nourishment. So Rabbi Nachman here also mentions Malchut. Malchut, majesty, is the Shekhinah that dwells in the world, is the aspect of God that we interface with in the world, right? There are many aspects to God. Malchut is the one that we experience. That's the dwelling place that God created for God's self that in the world. And the Shekhinah allows the vitality of the world to come down through, come through it. And every living thing is satisfied by its own measure through the Shekhinah's presence in the world, Malchut. But Rabbi Nachman says that very source of inspiration, which is the source of vitality for everything in the world, can also appear negative, right? There can be two birds of holiness. There are two birds of holiness, right? They bring down the holy song and the goodness, and there are two birds that can represent the klipa. The klipa, in Rabbi Nachman's thought, is rooted in excess of holiness. So in the creation of the world, right, the world was, and this is like the founding myth of the kelim shvurim, right, the broken vessels. In the creation of the world, God's infinite essence filled the world, and infinite light filled the world, right? And there were these kelim, there were vessels that were meant to contain that light, but God's light was too much, and that excess shattered the vessels that were meant to contain God's essence in the world, or God's presence in the world. And because these vessels couldn't contain the holiness of God, in the end they broke. And so the holiness that broke out from these vessels also reaches things in the world and becomes hidden in things in the world that are separated from God somehow, kivyachol, or separated from the divine will, or moving in the direction of the divine tendency. And so these are klipot. That's like the opaque covering of things, right? There really is God. God is found in many things in the world, or maybe the entire world. Rabbi Nachman also talks about a place where there is kivyachol, the inability to experience God, an empty space. We're not exactly going to touch on that tonight. It was too broad for me to cover. But there are klipot, right? There's divine spark that we on the surface can't see, because they're covered by this opaqueness that was created by the excess of divine presence in the world, of holiness in the world. Okay, so these klipot and the divine light, which is on the other side, the sitra achra, that remains within them and is as real as the existence of the holiness. So there's these two sides in the world. There's the covered holiness, there's the sitra achra, and then there's the divine presence. And so Rabbi Nachman saying, corresponding to who the person is, the musician, the singer, the chazan, the prophet, that's bringing down the song, right? Kind of this nigun of God, of godliness. There are good sources, right? Good singers, and then there's correspondingly evil singers, or wicked sources of this nigun that bring down from improper sources, right? That will bring down and interpret the nigun in the wrong way and turn it towards evil, and that's a danger, right? That we have access to the divine and to bringing down the divine nigun, the divine melody, but we have to be careful of what source we're using to interpret it, right? Which musician are we listening to? Okay, so it's easy to be drawn after nigunim of the wicked, and we're going to see what's the remedy to this. How do we figure out whether or not we're following the voice of God that is true and holy, or a voice of God that's been kind of made unholy, dirtied by the source that it comes from, that it comes through. Okay, so songs of lament and sadness. Rabbi Nachman tells us that the wicked singer and the danger of growing out of their nigun. And this idea is brought in other teachings. So we're going to look at teaching number 3 of Torah number 3. And this is what Rabbi Nachman teaches. Ve'ita b'kitvei Ari, and it's brought in the writings of the Ari of blessed memory, that the birds of the klipa are the intellect of the malchut de klipa, the kingdom of the other side. Him mochin shebemalchut b'klipa, v'hashtei tiburim chayot torot him binyan malchut de kedusha. So they come from these other birds, these other sources, and that will bring down kind of a negative translation of these. Okay, and this is the reason that people who are fond of saying that chazanim are fools, lacking in de'ah, for the malchut of holiness is presently in exile. What's the problem of the nigun that comes through the malchut that sometimes we find from the wrong source? That song, the malchut is in exile. Right, that aspect of God is kind of separated from divine unity. And song is generally drawn from the place of the prophets, from the mentalities of Dad, of Malchut, of holiness. Usual, right? We said they're coming from the same source, but somehow they get diverted into the negative space, into a place of wickedness. Now the Malchut's in exile, and the song is consequently impaired. And the Chazanim lack da'at. They don't have discernment. They don't have knowledge of how to interpret the song that's coming down from the source that could be, has the potential for good, but is being directed in the wrong way. For present, they don't have the power to draw song from its source in holiness, which is the mentalities and intellect of malchut, of holiness. In the future, when the malchut of holiness ascends, and God will be king over the entire earth, Azai, then the song will be uplifted and perfected in the aspect of the intellect of malchut, of holiness, from which the song is drawn. Then the song can be perfected in the future when malchut reigns over the earth in its aspect of holiness and not in its aspect of bringing down things that are more opaque and hidden. Okay. However, with the presence of these, okay, this is a lot of, right, Rabbi Nachman's creating this world and this story of how the divine presence is experienced in the world, right? And I can imagine when I studied comparative mysticism in college, I took a course, and there are many other mystical thinkers, right? Lahavdil, but this idea of like the melody comes up a lot, of being attuned with the divine as God is, right? The creation. There's one image that's stuck in my mind from a source that I don't exactly remember which it was. But creation is essentially God playing on a 10-stringed instrument, right? And if we're able to align ourselves and harmonize ourselves with the music that's being played, then we're in divine harmony and things go well in creation. And if we're not in harmony with that, right, there's discord, and then literal, metaphorical, and then literal discord. So it's similar to what Rabbi Nachman is saying, right? That we have to have discernment and understanding how are we understanding the nigun of God and how God is guiding us in our lives? Are we hearing it from the right people? And we can imagine we can interpret this into more practical teachings, right? And this is my layman's interpretation, right? Not of Rabbi Tamar Eldar's, right? Of saying, okay, I hear Torah, right? There's someone citing Torah and teaching Torah to me. How do I choose the right teacher, the right vessel, the right instrument? How do I know if it's in tune? How do I develop a good ear? Right? All of that metaphor kind of translates to being discerning in the sources that we choose to receive our Torah from, or even our life guidance, if we're going to take it out to the secular world. But Rabbi Nachman's talking about the divine guiding us, I think, in areas of Torah, but also I would think it extends to guiding us in all areas of our lives. How do we listen to the nigun that's guiding us in the way that it brings us closer to the divine as opposed to further apart? So here Rabbi Nachman talks about the people being drawn to, why are people drawn in the wrong directions, the wicked nigun. The wicked often sing songs of lament and depression. And that's due to them being an aspect of the soul of the mixed, they're being an aspect of the soul of a mixed multitude. They're descended, the Rishayim, from this Erev Rav, who went out with us from Egypt, but is in Hasidic thought, or in Rabbi Nachman's thought at least, often thought of as the presence amongst us, right? The Jewish people or the Jewish soul that confuses us and tries to lead us astray, right? An outside influence that comes into the Jewish people, joins us and says, what are we doing, right? Introduces doubt into the steadfast faith of Bnei Yisrael in Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? The ones who complain. Okay, so they're bechinat the Erev Rav. That's why the Rishayim, these wicked people, sing songs of depression, of sadness. And the mother of this Erev Rav, of these people who sow confusion. And again, this is all symbolic of what we can imagine and extend it to ideas that cause us confusion, times when we find ourselves in doubt about God, about paths in Judaism and Torah, right? Those are the influences that are guiding us. And so he's saying they're represented by the Erev Rav, right? There's something that's outside of us. It's not inherent to us. And the source of that is Lilith, is Lilith. The mother of the mixed multitude is Lilith, who is miyalelet. She whines constantly. And they therefore produce, the wicked people produce songs of lament. So why do people get drawn after these songs of lament? Why do I allow myself to let in these thoughts of doubt or confusion or being led astray, wickedness? You know, you can interpret it to whatever is resonant for you. Because they, and again, layering on of another symbol, they draw their source from the bechina, the essence of, and this is a Rabbi Nachman word. He'll say this is the image that is paradigmatic. Ve'enei Leah rakot, the eyes of Leah were weak. The eyes of Leah were weak. Umimchinat kilkul haraut, which is speaking about defects in our vision, our inability to see clearly. B'chinat meorot chaser, and this is connected to as well when the meorot is written without the luminaries are described in the pasuk without a vav, without a full rendering of the word. So it's written chaser, it's written missing something. That is speaking to an inability to see clearly, right? So that's why when people are drawn after wickedness or drawn after, in not in less extreme terms, drawn after doubt, drawn after a baser intention, right? Or not following the divine will, that's because that's owing to just a defect in our vision. Chaser dalilit, right? That defect in vision that is connected to Lilith. Okay. And song, so that's a defect. We have a weakness of vision leads us to go after things that we think are right but are really wrong, right? So we're going to have to ask the question of how do we strengthen our vision? How do we actually make sure that we're seeing clearly? Again, that question of discernment. How do we actually know? If you're telling me all these evil forces exist in the world and they're all very similar too, right? They come from the tziporim. It sounds like the nigun that we're supposed to follow and I'm being drawn after it. How do I actually discern what the true voices are? What's the path I'm supposed to follow? Okay, so here is a tikkun, a fixing for that. We've introduced a problem, which is also like it's kind of a beautiful harmonizing of the text of saying this is all a paradigm that's in the Tanakh, in the Torah already, right? Leah represented weakness because she cried, meaning it's not a statement of weakness of crying, but it's saying that her vision was occluded by the tears. And how is that fixed? In its essence, in its core, song comes from the tribe of Levi, right? And we understand why, right? They were the ones who sang in the Midrash. Shahayu menatzchim bashir, they were the ones who were the conductors. Shehem ibnei Leah, who were the children of Leah. So how did they fix that occlusion, that inability to see that was that might have been passed down to them by their mother? When Levi was born, Leah says, right, Leah gives an explanation of the name of each of her children. And when Levi is born, she says, this time my husband Yelaveh will become attached or accompany me. For with the birth of Levi, who is the element of music, right, where Levi is music and he's born, and that brings with it attraction. That brings with it Yaakov accompanying Leah, that her husband will be attached and attracted to her, and therefore song, which evolves and descends from there, from Levi, from the aspect of Leah's eyes were weak. So we have this weakness, this occlusion of vision, but then we have the child of Leah coming together with Yaakov, who is Levi, that union. Song which evolves from Levi and from Leah, but then from Levi has the power to attract, as in this time my husband will become attached, as explained above. So it's kind of Rabbi Nachman looking and saying, what's the power of music? Why is music powerful? If I'm looking for a paradigm in the Torah, why does it move people? And why are people then drawn after not good song? Because music is inherently attractive, right? And he roots it in relationship. When people say, okay, and we'll get to an explanation in just a minute, but we're gonna finish off this little piece. When people sing the aforementioned songs on Shabbat, here's our fix: sing on Shabbat, and that's how you know that they are to elevate these nigunim to the correct source, not to the other side, but to the side of the divine source that is holiness. Kiba Shabbat nishlam haor. On Shabbos, light is perfected. As our sages taught, haughty strides or taking too long, taking steps that are too wide on Shabbat, remove 1/500th of the ma'or, the light of one's eyes, and it returns in the nighttime with kiddush. So thus it is that the light is perfected on Shabbat. So that light that we might lose is brought back on Shabbat by walking too quickly, which PSA, don't walk, not quickly. Don't take too long strides on Shabbat because it might lessen the light in your eyes. Okay, that's in Brachot. That's not a Rabbi Nachman thing. Brachot 43b. Thus, it said, so it's returned to you when you make kiddush. So it said the light is perfected, corresponding to they walk on Shabbat with unpretentious steps. Postimbo psiaktana, right, from our songs on Shabbat. And then the nigunim, the melodies, are lifted up. The ones that had initially come from Leah, which was the occlusion of our sight, right, the inability to see the tears. They're lifted up al yidei Shabbat, shu b'chinat tikun haraut b'shleimut, which comes along. Shabbat comes along and fixes it, and is Shabbat is the rectification of sight, as we saw through kiddush that restores our sight, as explained above. Okay. What is Rabbi Nachman saying? How are we, people? We're doing okay? I can't tell how any of this is meeting you, but if that sounded like nonsense so far, that's okay. No, okay, Tim's got something from it, so I'm interested to hear your feedback once we get a little bit of an explanation here from Rabbi Tamar, and he says the following. In this teaching, Rabbi Nachman describes a certain phenomenon and attempts to explain it. The wicked, argues Rabbi Nachman, for the most part, sing melodies of lament and sadness, and it's human nature to be drawn to such melodies. Rabbi Nachman explains, the wicked are the soul of the mixed multitude, the heir of Rav. And that's the aspect, and the mother who gives birth to the soul is Lili, who constantly whines, the Yilala. The Silid is the aspect of Leah's eyes were weak. Rabbi Nachman cites the words of the Zohar that talk about the defect in the Me'orot of the creation story. Again, it follows the same principle as we saw above. There lies here the principle that already at the time of the creation of the world, excesses were created. the light within them being defective, a particle separated from the perfect profusion of divine light. Indeed, it bestows vitality on the world within which it is held captive, right? Those sparks of divine light that ended up getting stuck and held in things in the world, separated from the divine. But since it is separate and detached, you cannot bring God's world in a perfect manner and illuminate the world in its light. And this is a defective world of eclipses, of incomplete vision, of partial pictures, and in the words of Rabbi Nachman, of dim vision. And this, according to Rabbi Nachman, is the aspect of Leah. Now, the fixing of that we saw was turning towards the other, and all of the connection between Leah and Yaakov, which produces the correction, which is Levi. Okay, the essence of melody and musical instruments is brought into the world by Levi as it's brought in the Zohar. The essence of melody is from the side of Levi. This is a different Torah of Rabbi Nachman, again, to show you that his thesis and his idea of nigun is woven throughout all of his teachings, and one has to learn all of them to kind of put them together. I have not done that, but this teacher certainly has learned many more than I have. And so the essence of the melody is from the side of the Levites, and that's what Leah said. This time my husband Yilaveh will become attached to me. That's when Levi was born. For the joining of two things is by means of melody and musical instruments, and understand this. And he continues, and this is the aspect of musical instruments that they play at a wedding. So in this teaching, Rabbi Nachman says that the joining of two people, the joining of two things is by means of melody and musical instruments. It's also interesting to think of our just experience of song, how it moves people to dance, right? It moves people to be together, to move at the same rhythm, to experience the same things sometimes, and maybe perhaps to move in tandem with each other. A nigun has the power to join two things. Now he's talking about that on a larger level as well, not just two people dancing together, but to join energies. And we see with our own eyes the sweeping power of a nigun. Extreme enthusiasm, sometimes reaching the point of mass ecstasy, is rarely found today except at a musical performance. And we can think about the religious experience of attending concerts, right? The power of music to move many people at once and join them together and create a feeling of unity. There's nothing in the world that can compare to the power of music pouring out of giant amplifiers, sweeping thousands of people to other places, detaching them entirely from their everyday existence that surrounds them. Neither the word, written or spoken, nor even drama can create such a sweeping and unbreakable connection in the way that music can. Because music is able to sweep people off their feet, causing them to abandon their critical powers and lose control, the song of the wicked is far more dangerous than any article, lecture, or book to which a God-fearing person is likely to be exposed. So we have this very strong power of music. And it can be used for good and it can be used for evil. And we're asked to try and discern and make sure that it's coming from the right place. I wanted to show you, I had a quote here as well. I have the Tanakh here. Okay. Turning towards the other. Okay, so part of the fixing, as in the case of Leah and the weakness of her crying eyes, right, is turning towards Yaakov and creating Levi. And so Rabbi Nachman talks about this. Rabbi quotes the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Get yourself a rabbi. And through this, you'll rectify the aspect of malchut. And it's accomplished by kaneh, to acquire for yourself a companion. Okay, so he's breaking down this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. And he's going to explain the power of nigun to bring people together like Leah and Yaakov, to create Levi, that more pure source of music and nigun and guidance in the world. Okay. This is get yourself. Okay, this joins the two. Okay, so this joins mechaber shnei akruvim liot panim efanim kima'ar ish v'liot bazman sheYisrael osin retno shel makom. And this is a nod to this week's parsha as well, which I thought was really cool. This joins the two cherubs so that they are face to face, as the embrace of a man and his consort, right? The two kruvim, the malachim on top of the Aron Kodesh, when the Jewish people perform the will of the Holy One. Okay. So when a person is able to rectify the aspect of malchut, of where our interface with God in the world, correctly identifying the source or the translator of the nigun, of the music, of God's guidance through the world, you're able to do whatever, you're able to accomplish things in the world by fixing malchut. You can bring, okay, this is Rabbi Nachman's further teaching. I didn't want to, okay, here we go. That when a person rectifies the aspects of malchut, he's able to rule over whatever he chooses. He can bring death to one person or life to another. The world would then be ravaged. To this, the Mishnah says, judge everyone else favorably. It's not necessary to judge each person. It is necessary to judge each person favorably, for the Holy One has no desire in the world's destruction. God created the world in order to be settled, not to be destroyed. Okay, now we've brought a lot more images into the picture. Let's break them down. For Rabbi Nachman, so Rabbi Nachman uses the ideas mentioned in the Mishnah, the ideas that he's mentioned and played with all along to explain a Mishnah in Masechet Avot. And he says there's a causal succession between the three statements of the Mishnah in the following order, right? Acquire yourself a companion, Knei lecha chaver, then that will lead to Aseh lecha rav, and then that will lead to judging everyone favorably. Okay. For the acquisition of a companion, for making yourself a friend, a chaver, Rabbi Nachman requires a nigun. There's a psychological turning and a movement of acquiring a friend that resembles the psychological movement of singing. And he talks about the wind traveling through our windpipes and the voices issuing through the windpipe of a person. That's where the voice issues forth between the two kruvim on the Aron Brit Hashem. Okay, and the kruvim, as we saw above, represent our connection to God. Right, when we are on good terms with God, the kruvim face towards each other, and they are hugging. And when we're not on good terms with God, the kruvim reflect that, and they will not be hugging each other. And they're not face to face. So when we perform the will of God, God shines God's face upon the kruvim and upon us. And the nigun, which joins two things together, creates a connection between God and the Shekhinah. And we're dealing with the act of receiving this nourishment from an elevated place. And when a person sings, you lift your face outward in order to receive something, to receive connection, inspiration. Lifting of the face is similar to the attempt to acquire a friend, right? It requires you looking towards the other, turning towards the other, like the kruvim turning towards each other. And when a person lifts their face towards God, God can bestow God's blessing on them, on the light on them. And in this way, when a person turns their face up to sing, a nigun can turn into a channel, a connection between them and God. And when that happens, Rabbi Nachman saying that's when you acquire for yourself, you merit having a rabbi, a teacher. Acquire for yourself a friend, according to Rabbi Nachman, is a spiritual position, right, of turning towards the other. But when you make yourself a rabbi, that's the result of that. When a person turns your face towards God, God becomes your rabbi, your master, right? When you turn, and that's rooted in our ability to make God our master and follow in the ways of God, starts with turning towards the other and connecting with the other. That's the repair of malchut in a person, that you're no longer detached and separate from God. And I loved how that causation, right, that singing, right, we're saying like when you turn your face upwards, you're creating a channel between you and God. But that starts for Rabbi Nachman when you turn towards your fellow, right? Because you're supposed to create that connection. You're supposed to create a world that is cooperative, that builds connection between people, that builds civilization up and doesn't destroy it. Okay, So that's Rabbi Nachman saying that's how nigun is kind of socially rooted, right? It represents our connection to the divine, but it can only really happen when we turn towards each other. And that's the beginning of turning upwards towards God and saying, God is my master, when I'm able to connect with the other, which is really, really cool. And of course, the connection between that and singing in a group and creating connection, so that the connection, the divine human connection, is intertwined with the interpersonal connection. Okay. One last point on discernment when it comes to nigunim, when it comes to trying to hear the voice of God in the world. So we said there's Shabbat that brings that aspect of wholeness. Rabbi Nachman doesn't exactly explain how there, right? But it just seems to be the essence of Shabbat, that is shleimut, that is completion, that is rest, that is wholeness. There's the turning towards the other, which brings us together, right? And there's the Yaakov-Leah connection, that instead of having occluded vision, creates Levi, that says, I'm going to be with you, I'm going to accompany you in life. And that creates song that is holy as opposed to occluded and separate from God. That's the holy song of the Leviim and the Midrash, that's in service of God. And one last thing, which again, I love very much, is that Rabbi Nachman says a mode of discerning, a method of discerning what is a good nigun, what is really the voice of God and the guidance of God in the world, is Talmud study. Let no one say that Chassidut and Talmud are at odds with each other, because Rabbi Nachman here is saying you should learn more Gemara, right? After you learn this piece of Chassidut. So here's how Rabbi Nachman explains this. V'atikun shehu yuchal lishma negina mikol adam. Right, Rabbi Nachman's even saying you're able to listen, you as a receptacle of God's guidance in the world, you're able to listen and withstand nigina and melodies from wicked sources, right? You're able to withstand that and keep away from it, discern that it's not good, and go towards the good. What makes it possible to listen to the voice of any individual without being harmed, without being led astray? In other words, if you hear something and think, is this God? Is this the divine will? And you're able to understand. It's studying the oral Torah at night. Okay, so it's not only studying Talmud, but at night, dafka. And this refers to the Talmud, which is an aspect of light, as it brought in the Mishnah Sofer. When Moshe was on Har Sinai, here's the Midrash. Sorry, in the Midrash of Shofar Tov. When Moshe was on the Har Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, he had no way of knowing whether it was day or night, except that when he was taught the written Torah, he knew it was day. When he was taught the oral Torah, he knew it was night. Okay, so the oral Torah corresponds to this darkness. And that makes a lot of sense, right? The written Torah is explicit, what's on the page, and the oral Torah is this kind of guiding us through the spaces in between, right? The little marks on the letters, of trying to understand what's the hidden messaging behind this, what's the Masorah behind this, of not only what's explicitly on the page. Okay, so there's the light of the oral Torah, the explicitness, and then the oral tradition, which is darkness. Not that it leads us to darkness, but it helps us to go through and navigate the darkness. Nimtza. The oral Torah is an aspect of night. As our sages taught, God seated me, had me sit in dark places. Zet Talmud Bavli. What is God having me sit in the darkness? That's learning the Babylonian Talmud. I kind of love this. Right, like God's leading. God says, go sit in that confusion and wade through the sea of the Talmud. Machashakim, Hushivani, that drasha says Machashakim, darkness is Talmud Bavli. Lachoshech kara laila. So laila then, and choshech, darkness, is nighttime. So then you have that equation of Bavli equals nighttime, right? The Talmud equals nighttime. It's translated, right? By studying the 6 orders of Mishnah, Yitaken Hashit is Kain Shebakane. We're bringing it back to Nigun, okay? By the studying the 6 orders of the Mishnah, a person rectifies the 6 rings of the windpipe, via which the voice emerges. And this is Kumi Roni Balayla, rise, sing out in the night. Song is raised up by means of the night, the 6 orders of the Talmud. Okay, so song discernment of the proper melody is raised up through the night, which is the Talmud, but it's also better if you learn the Talmud at night, and that leads to higher levels of discernment. And here's what Rabbi Tamar explains. When a person is engaged in the pure study of Talmud, he is not interested in the halacha, but in the various aspects of the law that arise from the diverse opinions. This is why I love Talmud, by the way, also. So it really is like, it's really on the nose. Okay, so in the study of halacha, the decisive truth is the final law, whereas in the study of Talmud, the truth is revealed in the various aspects and different sides, right? You need the whole picture. You need to understand all sides of the machloket when you're studying Talmud, as opposed to the halacha, where you're trying to understand the bottom line. In this binary, it's not always this binary. Halacha shir nowadays is very often a lot of Talmud study, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so what Rabbi Nachman says, there's halacha and there's decisive truth in the final law, but Talmud is seeing all the aspects, examining the diamond from all sides, right? And the purpose of the study is to uncover the truth in all of its diversity, as it is reflected in the discussion of the Talmudic passage. This wondrous aspect of Talmud study, which uncovers the many-sided divine truth, is liable to turn into a stumbling block when a person develops within themselves the quality of finding the element of truth in everything. So the Talmud really can help you see that there's many different opinions, right? And they all have an aspect of truth to them, okay? But for this quality, so how do we, as halacha following Jews, right? In the end of the day, Rabbi Nachman wants us to stay away from that of saying, well, I could follow any opinion, right? There's beauty in seeing the diversity of the opinion and that truth can be found. But for this quality, just as it can redeem every idea and give it significance, it can also bestow legitimacy upon falsehood and evil, right? So you need to have this discernment as you're studying Talmud. The Talmud trains you in discerning, right? And understanding all the different sides. And then ultimately having to know in the end of the day what the conclusion is. It's paired with the study of halacha. You see it all, but you have to be able to see that you can't bestow legitimacy upon falsehood and evil. And he's concerned with the flip side of the study of Talmud. Okay. That's where there's also a piece here on nigun of the infinite, right? So there's the nigun that we sing through our connecting with the other, and when we want to connect with God, and as well as through Talmud study, right? The trying to uncover all of the sides of the divine truth, and then finally arrive at discernment through sharpening our discernment in Torah study and community. But there's also the nigun of the infinite, which is really fascinating, right? Like God, right? Rabbi Nachman argues that every knowledge or every aspect of the world has a melody. He calls it like a de'ah, but he says that everything has its own melody that it sings, right? It classically, there's a classic statement of Rabbi Nachman. Everyone knows the Shirat HaSavim, right? There's a song of nature, there's a song of grass. Everything has its essence that it's kind of putting out into the world. It's our job as receptacles of that, or as like, right, as singers of the divine, translators of these nigunim, of the notes, to be able to read it correctly, to be able to know which nigun is the one to follow. Okay, but Rabbi Nachman says actually God also has, right, the infinite, the Ein Sof, also has a nigun. And this is what he says: that song is also above all melodies and songs in the world, belonging to every science and belief, right? So there's the song of every belief, the song of every science, the song of everything in the world. And then there's God's song, which is above everything. And all the songs and melodies of the sciences are drawn from that song and melody, right? And God is the source of all of the individual melodies that come down, which is above all the songs and melodies of all the sciences. Okay, repeating. For it is the song belonging to the belief in the infinite light itself, which is above everything. There's a song of believing, of knowing that there's an infinite nature to the world, to God, and hearing that song, which contains everything. So there's a lot of potential for confusion here, right? There's a lot of potential for seeing the divine in everything, but then not having the correct level of discernment and being led astray by wicked voices, by wicked singers, by not seeing who's the proper translator of the divine voice. Again, we said there are remedies to this: Shabbat, community, Torah study at night, which helps us to discern and to cleave to God and to try and understand more of what the divine will really is, so we become vessels that correctly interpret the songs that we're hearing and meant to follow. Thoughts, comments, questions on that. I want to say on that like a pastiche on all those ideas that are kind of put together concerning the divine melody and the melodies of the world. Does any of this resonate with, we can also stop the recording now and then we can have a, give and take or responses without it being broadcast. So I can do that. Okay, so we'll stop the recording. Maybe that will make people more free to share anything that came up for them. All right.